ultimate deterrent. Farage mass deportation blueprint. Picture this. It's a crisp Monday morning in Westminster, and while most politicians are still nursing their weekend hangovers and crafting their usual platitudes about robust immigration policies, Nigel Farage drops what can only be described as a political nuclear bomb. 600,000 deportations. 5 flights a day. A complete dismantling of the human rights framework as we know it. And somewhere in City Hall, I imagine Sadiq Khan quietly placing his morning coffee down, leaning back in his chair, and thinking to himself, I bloody well saw this coming. Because here's the thing about populist movements. They don't emerge from a vacuum. They are the inevitable consequence of years of political negligence, of promises made and broken, of legitimate concerns dismissed as xenophobia, and of establishment figures who consistently underestimated the depth of public frustration. Khan, with his finger firmly on the pulse of London's diverse communities, has witnessed firsthand the growing polarization that makes Farage's latest gambit not just possible, but predictable. Let's be absolutely clear about what we're dealing with here. This isn't your garden variety electoral posturing. This is Nigel Farage, the man who's made a career out of being perpetually underestimated, unveiling what he calls Operation Restoring Justice, a mass deportation scheme so audacious it makes Donald Trump's immigration policies look positively moderate. We're talking about a UK deportation command that would make the Home Office look like a charity organization, complete with prefabricated detention centers housing 24,000 people and a data-sharing network that would make George Orwell spin in his grave. The sheer scale of ambition is breathtaking. Farage isn't just talking about tinkering around the edges of immigration policy. He's proposing a complete systematic overhaul that would fundamentally alter the character of British society. 5 deportation flights every single day. That's not a policy proposal. That's an industrial operation. It's the bureaucratization of human displacement on a scale Britain hasn't contemplated since the population exchanges of the post-war period. But here's where it gets interesting, and where Khan's prescient becomes relevant. The London mayor has consistently warned about the dangers of allowing legitimate immigration concerns to fester without proper political address. He has observed how uncontrolled rhetoric and unmet promises create the perfect breeding ground for exactly the kind of radical solution Farage is now proposing. When mainstream politics fails to provide answers, voters inevitably turn to those willing to offer dramatic alternatives, regardless of their feasibility or moral implications. Farage's efficiency czar, Zia Yusuf, claims there are over 650,000 adults without children living illegally in Britain. The precision of this figure is almost comical, as if somewhere in Whitehall there's a spreadsheet meticulously cataloguing every undocumented individual, complete with their breakfast preferences and shoe sizes. But the political genius lies not in the accuracy of the numbers, but in their deployment. These aren't statistics. They are weapons in a carefully orchestrated campaign to shift the Overton window so dramatically that even the most draconian policies begin to sound reasonable. The mechanics of Farage's proposal read like something from a dystopian novel. Banks, the NHS, HMRC, police, the DVLA, every institution that touches British life will become part of an integrated surveillance network designed to identify and track undocumented individuals. It's a level of state intrusion that would make the East Germans to see proud, wrapped in the reassuring rhetoric of border security and national sovereignty. The irony, of course, is that this comes from a movement that spent decades railing against the overreach of the Brussels bureaucracy. Then there's a carrot-and-stick approach. £2,500 to leave voluntarily, followed by the promise of dawn raids if you don't. It's psychological warfare disguised as immigration policy. The message is clear. Take the money and run, or we'll hunt you down like a common criminal. The subtext is even clearer. This country no longer wants you, and we're prepared to pay handsomely to make that abundantly obvious. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the cost. £10 billion to implement, with a promised $7 billion in savings over 5 years. These figures have the precision of a Treasury forecast and the reliability of a weather prediction. $4 billion for detention centers, $1.5 billion for flights, $2 billion for diplomatic arm twisting. It's extraordinary how quickly the party of fiscal responsibility becomes profligate when the cause is sufficiently populist. The international implications are staggering. Farage's team openly admits they'd be prepared to negotiate with the Taliban. Yes, the Taliban, to facilitate deportations to Afghanistan. British diplomats will be instructed that securing returns agreements is their highest priority, presumably above minor considerations like human rights, international law, or basic diplomatic decency. Countries that refuse to cooperate would face visa restrictions and sanctions, because nothing says global Britain quite like economic blackmail in service of mass deportation. And here's where Sadiq Khan's foresight becomes most apparent. He has consistently argued that immigration policy cannot be divorced from broader questions of social cohesion, economic integration, and civic participation. He has warned that treating immigration purely as a security issue, rather than a complex social phenomenon requiring nuanced responses, inevitably leads to precisely the kind of authoritarian overreach Farage is now proposing. The London mayor understood that when you consistently frame immigrants as invaders, deportation becomes not just policy but moral imperative. The legal framework Farage proposes is equally radical. Withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights, abolition of the Human Rights Act, new legislation making it illegal to destroy identification papers with prison sentences of up to 5 years. This isn't immigration reform, it's constitutional revolution. We're talking about dismantling 75 years of post-war human rights architecture in service of what Farage euphemistically calls normal country behavior. The domestic political response has been predictably tribal. Kimi Badenoch accuses reform of copying conservative homework, apparently unaware that homework typically involves showing you're working rather than simply providing increasingly extreme answers. Labour's Ellie Reeves points out the obvious practical and ethical holes in Farage's proposals, while government spokespeople maintain the studied neutrality of officials who know their ministers are privately terrified by the popularity of what they publicly condemn. But perhaps the most telling aspect of this entire affair is Farage's justification for his extremism. He warns of genuine threats to public order, of extreme hopelessness and growing anger, of the risk of civil unrest if dramatic action isn't taken. It's the classic populist move. Create the crisis, then position yourself as the only solution. The beautiful circularity is that by proposing policies guaranteed to inflame tensions, Farage can then point to those very tensions as justification for even more extreme measures. The channel crossing numbers provide convenient ammunition. 29,000 migrants so far this year, 52,000 since Starmer took office. Each crossing becomes evidence of government failure, each arrival another data point in Farage's argument for systematic deportation. The human stories behind these statistics, families fleeing persecution, individuals seeking safety, children born into circumstances they never chose, become irrelevant in the face of aggregate numbers and political point scoring. What's particularly insidious about Farage's approach is how it weaponizes legitimate concerns about immigration capacity and integration. There are genuine questions about housing, public services, social cohesion, and economic impact that deserve serious political attention. But by proposing solutions so extreme they make rational debate impossible, Farage effectively monopolizes the immigration discourse while making constructive policymaking more difficult. Sadiq Khan saw this coming because he understands something fundamental about British politics that many of his Westminster colleagues have missed. When you consistently ignore or dismiss public concerns, you don't make them disappear. You simply ensure they'll eventually be addressed by someone willing to offer solutions you find unpalatable. The London mayor has spent years trying to bridge the gap between cosmopolitan liberalism and working-class concerns about rapid demographic change, recognizing that failure to do so creates space for exactly the kind of radical populism Farage represents. The international context makes Farage's proposals even more ominous. We're living through a period of global democratic backsliding, where established norms around human rights, international law, and institutional constraints are under sustained attack. From Trump's America to Orbán's Hungary, the playbook is depressingly familiar. Identify a vulnerable minority, promise dramatic action, gradually dismantle institutional safeguards, then use enhanced state power to deliver on increasingly extreme promises. What makes this particularly British is a veneer of reasonableness wrapped around fundamentally unreasonable proposals. Farage doesn't present himself as a revolutionary. He's simply the sensible voice advocating for what normal countries do. The genius lies in making the abnormal seem inevitable, the extreme appear moderate, and the unthinkable feel like common sense. It's political alchemy of the highest order, transforming base xenophobia into electoral gold. The economic arguments deserve particular scrutiny. The idea that mass deportation would somehow generate net savings ignores the broader economic impact of removing hundreds of thousands of people from the labor force, the consumer base, and the tax system. Many of those targeted for deportation are undoubtedly contributing to the economy in ways that wouldn't show up in Farage's calculations. But economic rationality has never been the point. This is about identity, belonging, and who gets to call themselves British. The human cost is deliberately obscured behind bureaucratic language and administrative efficiency. Prefabricated two-person rooms sound so much more palatable than detention cells. Voluntary repatriation carries less emotional weight than forced exile. Secure immigration removal centers suggest professional administration rather than mass incarceration. The linguistic sanitization is essential to the project's political viability. What's most chilling about Farage's proposal is how it normalizes the abnormal through sheer audacity. When you're talking about 600,000 deportations, the conversation inevitably shifts from whether such policies are desirable to whether they are technically feasible. The moral dimension gets lost in discussions of logistics, costs, and implementation timelines. Before you know it, you're debating the efficiency of different deportation methods rather than questioning whether mass deportation is something Britain should be contemplating at all. The international diplomatic consequences would be profound. Britain would essentially be asking other countries to help implement what amounts to ethnic cleansing while simultaneously threatening them with sanctions if they refuse. It's difficult to imagine a faster way to destroy what remains of British soft power and international credibility. But then again, Farage has never been particularly concerned with Britain's reputation abroad. His entire political project is predicated on the idea that international opinion is irrelevant compared to domestic popularity. The surveillance implications are equally disturbing. Farage's integrated data-sharing network would represent the most comprehensive state monitoring system in British history, far exceeding anything contemplated even during wartime. Every interaction with public services, every banking transaction, every contact with officialdom will become potential evidence in deportation proceedings. It's the infrastructure of a police state, justified by the language of border security. And through it all, Sadiq Khan's warnings echo with prophetic accuracy. He understood that immigration policy cannot be separated from broader questions of social justice, economic equality, and civic inclusion. He recognized that when mainstream politics fails to provide hope, voters will inevitably turn to those promising simple solutions to complex problems. He saw that the gap between cosmopolitan values and working-class concerns wouldn't remain unfilled indefinitely. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. There are perfectly reasonable approaches to immigration policy that balance humanitarian concerns with legitimate worries about capacity and integration. Countries across Europe have managed to develop coherent responses to migration pressures without resorting to mass deportation fantasies. But those solutions require political courage, sustained investment, and a kind of nuanced thinking that doesn't translate easily into campaign slogans. Instead, we have Nigel Farage promising to solve decades of policy failure through administrative brutality, wrapped in the reassuring language of common sense and national sovereignty. It's populism in its purest form, offering simple answers to complex questions, promising dramatic action instead of patient reform, and positioning extremism as a reasonable response to establishment failure. The most disturbing aspect of all this is how normal it's beginning to sound. When you've spent years hearing about immigration as an invasion, deportation starts to feel like self-defense. When you've been told repeatedly that existing institutions are failing, dismantling human rights protection seems like necessary reform. When you've been convinced that traditional politics offers no solutions, extreme politics starts to look like the only alternative. Sadiq Khan saw this coming because he understands that democracy's greatest vulnerability isn't external attack, but internal decay, the gradual erosion of norms, the systematic undermining of institutions, and the weaponization of legitimate grievances in service of authoritarian ambitions. He recognized that when established politicians consistently fail to address public concerns, those concerns don't disappear. They simply migrate to political actors willing to offer more dramatic solutions. The question now isn't whether Farage proposals are feasible. They're almost certainly not, at least not in their current form. The question is whether their very articulation shifts British political discourse in ways that make previously unthinkable policies suddenly thinkable. When mass deportation becomes part of mainstream political debate, When human rights protections are treated as optional extras, when surveillance states are rebranded as efficiency measures, the damage to democratic culture extends far beyond any single policy proposal. This is why Khan's warnings matter, and why his prescience feels so uncomfortable. He saw that failure to address immigration concerns through mainstream democratic means would inevitably create space for anti-democratic alternatives. He understood that when politics fails, populism succeeds. He recognized that extremism doesn't emerge from nothing. It grows in the soil of legitimate grievances left unaddressed by responsible leadership. The real test isn't whether Britain will implement Farage's mass deportation scheme. It's whether the country's democratic institutions are strong enough to resist the authoritarian temptations that make such schemes politically attractive. And on that question, Sadiq Khan's track record of prescience offers little comfort. This is the Britain we're living in now, a country where mass deportation has become a mainstream political proposal, where human rights are treated as optional, and where the infrastructure of authoritarianism is being constructed one policy document at a time. Farage may not become Prime Minister, but his ideas are already reshaping what's considered politically possible. And somewhere in City Hall, I imagine Sadiq Khan is thinking, "I told you so." The ultimate deterrent isn't just about stopping boats or deporting migrants. It's about deterring democracy itself, making normal politics seem so inadequate that extreme politics appears inevitable. That's the real genius of Farage's proposal, and that's why Khan saw it coming from miles away. The question isn't whether we'll implement these policies, it's whether we'll still recognize the country we become by the time we're done debating them. What happens next will determine whether Britain remains a democracy that occasionally flirts with authoritarianism, or becomes an authoritarian state that maintains the trappings of democratic legitimacy. On that choice, everything depends. And if you want to understand how we got here and where we're heading, you know exactly where to find the analysis that saw it all coming. Subscribe, because this story is far from over, and you won't want to miss what comes next in the continuing decline of British democracy.